In every man's life there comes a time to look in the mirror and ask yourself, is my sensor big enough? Would I be more cinematic with a huge, throbbing, IMAX-ready sensor?
So big.
You can really see how big it is. It's a very large sensor.
Does size even matter?
Does size matter? No. And it works both ways.
Well, my friend, once again it's time to bring the scorching light of science to the cobweb-infested cellar of camera myths. Put your nerd pants on, cause this gonna be good. It feels like we have just moved from Super 35 to full frame, and now even larger sensors are looming on the horizon. Forget medium format, I'm talking about 65mm and beyond. Blackmagic Design recently announced the price and availability of their Ursa Cine 17K 65mm camera, and it's sending shockwaves throughout the industry. Previously, if you wanted to shoot 65mm digitally, your only choice would be the Alexa 65. And the Alexa 65 was just a genius move by Arri. I mean, what's more desirable than the most expensive camera? That's right, the camera that's so expensive that you can't even buy one. Only available through Arri rental, Alexa 65 is like catnip for Hollywood blockbusters and big-name DPs who are too cool to shoot on peasant cameras that cost a mere 100 grand.
It's such a powerful, immersive format.
But now Blackmagic is coming hard for Arri's lunch money with Ursa Cine 17K. At 30 grand a pop, I wouldn't call it affordable, but definitely attainable as a rental item, especially for mid to low tier productions where every penny counts and you don't have 4 Technocranes hanging around in the backlot just in case. So calling it a poor man's Alexa 65 doesn't seem too far-fetched, but for me the more interesting question is why? Why did Blackmagic make this camera?
We made you because we could.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
I mean, what's the deal with this large format craze? Why is everyone so sure that bigger is always better? And with discussions around Ursa 17K, the age-old questions rise yet again. Is there a particular look that comes from large sensors? How does sensor size affect lens selection, field of view and depth of field? And is there some unique perspective onto the world only available on large sensor cameras? By the end of this video, you'll know everything you need to know about how sensor size affects the perceptible characteristics of an image, so stick around. But first, if you'll allow me to indulge in a little rant. So I was at some masterclass thing in London, and during the break this guy kept talking my ear off about medium format cinematography.
Lot of blessings piling up that I ain't even.
Just like you are falling through the image, man. It's so immersive, you know what I'm saying?
And I asked him exactly what he meant by that, and he was like,
I don't know, bro, it's just like that feeling you get with medium format, you know? You just can't get that feeling on small sensors, bruv. You know what I'm saying?
Please, bruv. If there's one thing I absolutely can't stand, it's that sommelier language, like, oh, it's got a fruity bouquet with notes of barberry and sandalwood. Bullshit.
Bring me a bag full of Bigfoot's droppings or shut up!
If we want to be talking about image quality, camera sensors and optics in an intelligent way, we need to articulate precisely what we are talking about. And it's not rocket science. It's not that hard to identify and isolate perceptually recognizable attributes of a moving image. Words like resolution, angle of view, perspective, compression, depth of field, they stand for concrete, measurable and visually identifiable things that can be studied and compared in an objective way. And words like cinematic, intimate, immersive, painterly, epic are describing warm fuzzies you get in your tummy when you look at a picture, and they have no place in camera reviews and comparisons. Yet still we have big-name Hollywood DPs spouting certifiable garbage like factually wrong statements, dressing them with copious amounts of wine-tasting language. And look, I get it. Who am I to disprove these venerable masters of their craft? Just some guy from YouTube ranting in his bedroom. But don't take my word for it, listen to the guy who actually did hard science on these things. A top-level Hollywood DP who shot Knives Out and The Last Jedi, among other things, and who actually knows what he's talking about. I'm talking about the guy who debunked the resolution myth, debunked the film versus digital myth, and debunked the large format myth. I'm talking, of course, about Steve Yedlin.
I don't believe that the tools enforce an aesthetic look as much as some people seem to think. So to me, the most important thing about a camera system is technical, because I'm going to define my own aesthetics no matter which camera I use.
All his stuff and more is out there, including the freaking Wikipedia, because a lot of it is just plain old physics, testable by the good old scientific method.
Yeah, Mr. White. Yes, science!
Links to sources for this video are in the description below. But people don't seem to care, because digging into this stuff is hard. Testing it is even harder, and wine tasting BS is easy. No one actually has to prove anything to anybody. Like the medium format guy I met, you can just say stuff and believe whatever you want to believe. And look, I get it. It's a visual medium and a lot of it is subjective. Cinematography stands smack dab in the middle between technical and artistic, and some of my favorite DPs are more like painters than cameramen. I'm totally okay to talk about how a picture makes you feel. Just don't use wine tasting language to sell me gear or induce gas or FOMO. So, if there's indeed some kind of large format look, we should be able to pinpoint exactly where it comes from, and even more importantly where it absolutely certainly doesn't come from. So let's get on that. Now, resolution is a pretty straightforward one. If you desire more resolution for whatever reason, you can either cram more pixels into the same space or increase the sensor size. There's a limit to how small you can make the pixels before you start running into diffraction and smearing issues and your noise performance suffers. So at some point, yeah, if you want to increase the resolution, you're going to need a bigger sensor. But you just don't need to go as big as 65mm for that. Super 35 already can deliver all the resolution you would ever need, at least for conventional applications of film and video. But just for the sake of argument, let's say you want some extra room to stabilize and reframe, although I would call it lazy filmmaking, and let's say you need some extra pixels for VFX, although they seem to be able to manage just fine with 4K or even less. And let's say your imaging pipeline doesn't have the greatest debayering algorithm, so you want to oversample to get full color resolution out of your Bayer sensor. Now, all these benefits are already up for debate, but let's just say you need all that. Well, all of these benefits can be maximized with a modest increase in resolution of just about 20% over the delivered target. But let's play it safe and overshoot by a third. So if our delivery resolution is DCI 4K, then 4096 times 1.333 would be 5.4K. Let's say that 5.4K is our minimum acquisition resolution. And at that resolution we can't go smaller than Super 35, because otherwise the pixels are going to be too small. So if our Super 35 sensor is 5.4K, then to maintain the same pixel density, our full frame sensor needs to be 7.8K, and our 65mm sensor, which in reality is 54.12mm wide, needs to be 11.7K. And a purely theoretical 70mm IMAX digital camera would have to be at least 15K.
Nice.
So it would seem that an 8K full-frame sensor gives you the flexibility of dual formats, both well in excess of 4K delivery resolution, without ever going into the crazy town of 65mm. And it just so happens that Sony Venice 2, which is steadily gaining market share in high-end productions, offers exactly that. And with these new Ursa Cine cameras, the number of Ks doesn't tell the whole story, because these sensors are not Bayer pattern, they are RGBW. They have a 6x6 color filter pattern instead of a 2x2, so the color resolution is just 1/3 of Bayer. That's why they overcompensate with an excessive amount of total resolution. So you should really think of Ursa 12K as a full RGB 4K camera, and of Ursa 17K as a full RGB 5.6K camera. I'm oversimplifying, of course, and there's a lot of black magic, if you will, happening on the codec side, but the main selling point of 12K or 17K is not to use that resolution one-to-one. It's that you get a full-color, high-quality 4K image with extremely fine noise oversampled from that bonkers 12K acquisition resolution. 12K is just a different way of arriving at a very high-quality 4K image. Whether it's the best way is an open question, but as an owner-operator, I would always prefer fewer better pixels, because I'm the one paying for storage. But I digress. If we are talking about resolution, then the verdict is yes, larger sensors do allow for higher resolutions. But for 4K delivery, there's no technical need for a sensor larger than Super 35. And an 8K full-frame sensor already covers all the possible bases with any kind of cropping, oversampling and VFX applications you can reasonably think of, and with the largest lens selection available. Now, this is the big one, angle of view. When trying to describe large format look, people often say stuff like you can get closer on a longer lens with the same angle of view, but it's more compressed. Which is both nonsensical and false, even though big-name DPs sometimes say it. But the underlying belief is that you can get some unique perspective onto the world that you can't get with smaller formats, and this is so easily debunked. Now, we will get into why they are saying that stuff later in the video. They are not dumb, I mean, they are mistaken, but there are reasons behind this mass confusion. So let's unravel all of that step by step. There are several things being conflated here: focal length, angle of view and perspective distortion. Let's start with the angle of view. Angle of view is determined by a simple ratio of focal length to sensor size. And that means we should really stop saying words like long lens or wide lens in reference to specific focal length. A 35mm lens can be the wide lens on a larger format or a portrait lens on a smaller format, but there's nothing inherent about that number that dictates the field of view. It's the combination of the lens and the sensor. And if we are moving into the world of mixing formats, we should start using degrees instead of millimeters to describe the field of view of a shot. Any kind of viewfinder app like Artemis will show you this, but I wish cameras also had that option, because they could easily take the active sensor area, lens data and display the angle of view. So there's no unique angle of view available only on specific formats, because you can easily match it by adjusting focal length. All you need to do is just multiply the focal length by the relative crop factor, which is the ratio of the two formats being compared. For example, if we like the field of view of an 18mm lens on an Alexa mini sensor, then to match this field of view on an Alexa 65, we would need exactly a 34.47mm lens. There is absolutely no difference in field of view for the resulting shots. Both the 18mm and the 35mm are functionally the same wide-angle lens, just on different formats. Most DPs, especially the older ones, shot Super 35 for most of their careers, so they learned focal length and their respective fields of view on that format. So when they try a large format camera but use the same focal length out of habit, they see the angle of view has changed and they think it's the inherent look of the format. And then they make the crucial mistake that leads to all of this confusion. They move the camera closer. You've probably seen GIFs like this, illustrating perspective distortion, meaning how wide lenses expand the space and how long lenses compress the space behind the subject. And I guess they are partly to blame for this confusion, because again they instill belief that a certain numbered focal length produces a certain kind of look, which is not accurate. Perspective in the strictest sense of the word is determined by one thing only: camera position, because it's just a ray-traced projection of a 3D world onto a 2D plane, like camera obscura, a basic hole in the wall. And you change perspective by just moving that hole to another place, new perspective. But if we put a lens in that hole, another variable is introduced, the angle of view. So there are two variables that create that look, that rendering of space: camera position and the angle of view. We already established how you can maintain your angle of view by either focal length or sensor size. So the only thing left to match the two formats is to put the camera in the exact same position in relation to the subject, and you'll get a shot that matches one-to-one in terms of perspective. In any kind of photography, the single most important decision that defines the look of a shot is where you put the camera in relation to the subject. If at any point you are moving the camera to match the perspective, you've already failed. You are simply doing a different shot. But if you shoot from the same position with the same angle of view, you get the same perspective regardless of sensor size. And if you don't believe me, study this astonishingly well-executed camera test by Manuel Lubers. that I'm totally stealing to illustrate the points here. I have no idea how he was able to finance this test, but he shot Alexa Mini and Alexa 65 through a stereoscopic rig, effectively controlling for the exact same camera position in real time. He matched the angle of view of the cameras by equivalent focal length and a slight crop where a mathematically perfect focal length was not available. And you can totally see the perfect match for perspective and angle of view between these two vastly different sensor sizes. And for me that's already enough to put the whole large format issue to rest, because the idea that 65mm gives you some kind of unique perspective on the world just doesn't hold water. How intimate or epic your shot looks depends entirely on where you put the camera and what's the angle of view, both of which are format independent really. But there's still one pretty huge thing left to discuss, and that's depth of field. Now, depth of field, even though we all perfectly understand what it means, is subjective and actually not the correct term to use. The proper technical term to measure out of focus areas is blur circles. And much like with angle of view and perspective, there's an optical formula for that.
Yes, science!
This formula calculates precisely the diameter of blur circles, but the good news is that you don't even need to memorize or understand it. What you need to take away from it is that blur circle size is determined only by the subject distance and the aperture. And that makes total sense. We all know from experience that if you get closer to the subject and or open the aperture, the background gets blurrier. So if our objective here is to get the same size of blur circles between the two formats, we need to make sure that none of the two variables change. We don't want to move the camera or the subject, and we want to achieve the same aperture. And the aperture is the tricky bit here, because aperture in the formula refers to the absolute aperture, meaning the diameter of the hole that limits the cone of rays that enter inside, which in a more complex lens, like the ones we use, is the entrance pupil. So that's absolute aperture, but the f-stop numbers that we're used to, like f1.2, f1.4, is relative aperture, which is the ratio of the entrance pupil to focal length. And we changed the focal length to keep the angle of view the same, remember? And longer focal lengths tend to have larger entrance pupils due to the magnification factor. So now, even though angle of view is the same, the lens is longer and the entrance pupil is larger, letting in more light and decreasing the depth of field. So now, to get the same entrance pupil diameter, we need to control for that focal length change. And for that, all we have to do is to multiply the f number by, you guessed it, the relative crop factor. So to match the Alexa Mini at f2.8, you need to close down the aperture on Alexa 65 to f5.3. And voila! That's it! We've perfectly matched the small Super 35 sensor with a huge 65mm sensor for angle of view, perspective and depth of field. The final image is identical in terms of optics, and all we did was magnify the focal length and f-stop by the relative crop factor, and crucially, we did not move the camera or the subject.
I did not. Oh, hi, Mark.
Now go on and tell me that somehow this shot is more immersive or epic than this shot. And if you do, well...
That is one big pile of shit.
Now, while the formula works perfectly, there are still some real-world limitations and edge cases that are going to be raised every time this issue is discussed. It is indeed easier to achieve shallow depth of field on a large sensor, but that really peaks at full frame. Yeah, if you have a 35mm lens that opens up to 1.2 and covers full frame, you would need a 24mm f.8 lens to match it on a Super 35 format, and lenses like these don't exist, at least not in mass production. But this is an edge case, because real-world lenses tend to have smaller max apertures if they also have larger cover areas and vice versa. That's why there are almost no ultra-fast lenses that cover 65mm. They are all around f2.8, and that equates to f1.4 on Super 35, which is totally achievable. For example, Arri Master Primes are all T1.3 and they start at 12mm, so you can get wide and shallow up the wazoo if that's your thing. There are exceptions, however. Some medium format glass covers 65mm. For example, to match a Mamiya 80mm f1.9 on a Super 35 sensor, you would need a 42mm f1 lens. Which is not impossible, by the way. I mean, Stanley Kubrick used an f0.7 NASA lens for candlelit scenes in Barry Lyndon, but shot it on Super 35 film. So there are edge cases on smaller formats too. The question is, how much shallower do we want to get and why? If we are talking about taste, I personally find that extremely shallow depth of field looks distracting and immersion breaking. It really flattens the 3D space and makes the whole thing look like a moving photograph, which I personally don't find appealing at all. The vast majority of movies are shot at around T2.8 for interiors and T5.6 for exteriors, because most directors actually want to see the space that the characters are inhabiting. But if you still want that glassy, blurry, out-of-focus mush, again, there really is no objective need for you to go to 65mm to get that. Full frame already has you covered. So, out of 3 major ingredients of a photographic look, sensor size only affects one, and even that one indirectly. To keep the angle of view the same, we change focal length, and longer focal lengths result in a larger entrance pupil and thus shallower depth of field. That's the whole trick, really. And even that can be matched to an extent, so there's no large format look, no unique perspective or field of view. But if it's so easily debunked, then why do these amazing DPs keep harping on this idea that large format allows you to get closer to the subject while still seeing a lot of the location in the frame? Why again and again do they single this out as the main selling point of large format? I mean, it's statistically unlikely that they're all a bunch of morons.
You're not dealing with morons here.
So they must be getting this idea from somewhere, right? And yes, they are speaking from years of practical experience, but like with a lot of filmmaking wisdom that's been passed down through generations of cinematographers, it's based on a lot of prior beliefs taken for granted, some of which are simply outdated. Let's go back to that RD quote where he said he doesn't want the distortion of a wider lens. Now, he probably didn't mean perspective distortion, he probably meant barrel distortion. Because as an old-school cameraman who is known for his clean look, he tends to avoid lenses that introduce any kind of distortion. And for a lot of older lenses that he used to work with, yeah, the shorter the focal length, the stronger the fisheye effect. But that's just not a thing anymore. I mean, these days he shoots with signature primes that are effectively rectilinear lenses, meaning zero distortion all the way up to 12mm. Besides, barrel distortion is two-dimensional and thus extremely easy to correct in post or even in camera. I mean, your mirrorless camera does it without you even noticing. So today the amount of distortion is based on the quality of the lens in question and not necessarily on the individual focal length. Because of that, a funky 35mm lens can have more distortion than a super clean 14mm lens. But that belief is still deeply entrenched. And that's where these false assumptions about the unique perspective of a large format are rooted. When DPs talk about a close-up or feeling close to a character, they don't just mean how big the face is in the frame. They mean the physical proximity of the camera to the face.
I mean, I think it's a totally different effect to an audience looking at somebody on the end of a 100mm lens, as opposed to somebody that's being shot on a 27 close to or 21.
Remember that where you put the camera in relation to the subject is half the look, the other half is angle of view. The combination of the two determines how the space is rendered and sends subconscious signals to the audience that, hey, we're now inside the intimate space of this person. And you don't get that same feeling when shooting a close-up on a 150mm lens from afar, because the space is compressed and turned into mush, and the audience instantly picks up on those spatial cues. So what all of these DPs seem to want is to get close with the camera but still have a lot of the location in the field of view. That's the same idea that's behind anamorphic. So why don't they just use a wider freaking lens? Well, it's because it was drilled into them that you just don't shoot a close-up on anything wider than a 35, because you don't want your hot Hollywood actress to look like she has mumps. Again, they have learned to equate certain image characteristics with certain focal length. So in their minds, how close you can get to the actor is limited by the focal length you can use. And then yeah, if you put these artificial limitations upon yourself, then the only way to get wider and closer is by increasing the format size. So it's not surprising that they get all warm and fuzzy inside when they see a 40mm lens becoming a wide-angle lens on a 65mm camera. They think they are gaming the system somehow. But that thinking is outdated in the modern landscape of lenses, and it will take some time for everybody experimenting with different formats and lenses to unlearn these rules to decouple focal length numbers from angles of view and perspective you can get with them. But the truth is that it's perfectly okay to shoot a close-up on Super 35 with an 18mm lens and get that close and wide perspective you desire if the lens in question is distortion-free. I mean, Chivo has done it for years, shooting wide-angle master primes on Super 35, and nobody seems to be complaining. And he shoves that thing right up in DiCaprio's nostril, so yeah, it feels really damn close and intimate. The latest argument I've heard about 65mm is that you get more character out of your lenses because you are using the larger part of the image circle. So as the image degrades towards the edges, that funkiness around the corners can be desirable. And as a fellow connoisseur of dirty images, I totally get that, and that's a valid argument. If you are hell-bent on covering the entire image circle of a particular lens, then yeah, you will be forced to use a larger format or a focal reducer. For example, to get the maximum funk and swirl out of a Helios 44, you would indeed require a 65mm camera or medium format camera at least. But that's a very different way of thinking when you start with a lens in mind and then arrive at the camera. For example, if I wanted Helios 44 to be my normal lens in terms of angle of view, say 45 to 50 degrees, and that's non-negotiable, then yes, the only way I could force that is by stepping up to 65mm. But that's crazy town, changing camera systems to force a particular lens into a particular field of view. That's too damn rich for my blood. You could take a Super 35 lens and chuck it onto a full-frame camera and get the same effect. And the great thing about full frame is you have a lot of choices. Clean, modern, funky, vintage, anamorphic, spherical, whatever floats your boat. In fact, by going up to the huge format, you are limiting your lens selection severely. So if it's funk you're after, again, there are straighter roads to get there. You don't have to change formats to get a particular lens characteristic. But if you are so filthy rich that you pair cameras to lenses and not lenses to cameras, then by all means, don't let me stop you.
Quick fashion question. Should I wear this Uzi with my low tops?
So let's tally it all up. Are there actually any tangible benefits to 65mm acquisition? Resolution. Yes, you can get higher resolutions with larger formats, but for 4K delivery all the possible benefits are maximized at around 5.6K, for which you don't need to go to 65mm unless shooting on ARRI is non-negotiable for you. Which, by the way, I think is the main selling point of Alexa 65. Big-name Hollywood DPs want that extra resolution, especially for CG-heavy epics, but they still want to be shooting on ARRI. Angle of view. No benefit whatsoever. You just need to stop paying attention to focal length numbers and start thinking in terms of angle of view. You can get as wide as you want on any format as long as the lens is clean. Perspective. No change to perspective whatsoever. Going to another format doesn't force you to move the camera, and that's the only thing that dictates perspective. That's why blocking and framing will always be more important than the camera. Depth of field. It is indeed easier to achieve extremely shallow depth of field on large sensors. If you are looking for that separation on a wide shot, then yeah, large format is the way to get there. But that look is not universally desirable or unique to 65mm format. In terms of close-up-ability, Super 35 can achieve the same close and wide perspective using clean wide-angle lenses. The fact that some DPs refuse to use certain focal lengths for close-ups is a self-imposed limitation based on outdated beliefs. Lens character. If you are hell-bent on stretching the image circle of a particular full-frame or medium format lens, then yes, but there are equivalently funky lenses on more conventional formats. And that's it! Not many benefits really. It really boils down to resolution and shallow depth of field. And that certainly doesn't amount to any kind of look. Because what is a look? It has to be easily identifiable by the viewer. Black and white is a look, anamorphic is a look, bleach bypass is a look, fisheye is a look, dark and contrasty is a look, bright and colorful is a look. But none of these are format dependent. They are either lighting, optics or color treatment. And you can be wide or tight, far away or up close, dark or bright, funky or clean on any format. Resolution is not a look either. No one can tell you how you've arrived at your 4K delivery image, whether it was upscaled from 3.2K or downscaled from 17K. Yes, resolution can have its benefits in post-production, but ultimately it's invisible to the audience. The closest thing that approaches the look territory is shallow depth of field, but again, it's not unique to 65mm because the audience can't tell how it was achieved. Yes, they can see it's shallow, but what it was shot on is anyone's guess. It's the lighting, the lens choice and the color treatment that create the look of the film, not the sensor size. And I personally will take a better sensor over a larger sensor any day of the week.
I don't personally think of the camera as creating a look at all. I think of it as a data collection machine, and we make the photographic look with the mathematical transforms that we use in the post pipeline.
So even though I personally don't see a need for a 17K 65mm camera, I'm sure Blackmagic Design will enjoy great success with it, and deservedly so. The simple fact that you don't need something never stopped anyone from making it and selling it successfully if there's enough demand for it. And there will always be demand for making things bigger, because most people think bigger is better, and that's not about to change anytime soon. But for us camera nerds, we can all sleep a little better in our mom's basement, knowing that there's no unique perspective or look available only on 65mm cameras. Before we part ways, I want to take the time to thank you guys. I had a big influx of viewers on the channel thanks to the much appreciated shoutout from Mr. Camera Conspiracies himself, who liked my dynamic range video.
Pretty damn good. It was a masterpiece, and it only has like 2,000 views, and I feel embarrassed for him. Sad that he didn't get the recognition that he needs from you. Go watch it.
A lot of people left PayPal donations and super thanks here on YouTube, and I just want to say thank you guys. And a special thank you to the very first channel member here on YouTube, Przyroda w domu, which I'm guessing is Polish for nature at home. Thanks man, I hope you are still subscribed, because otherwise this is awkward. On a serious note, I've always believed that every dollar you spend is a vote you cast on the kind of world you want to be living in. So it's very encouraging to get this support, this vote of confidence from you guys, and it inspires me to continue this YouTube journey. I enjoy making these videos, and the fact that a lot of people seem to find them educational and entertaining is a reward in itself, but the volume and the frequency of content I am able to put out is directly dependent on your continued support, so thank you very much for that, I truly appreciate it. Let me know what you guys thought of this episode, and I'll see you in the next video.